last topic, that it is a various tradition in various countries. So this is something that is mostly related to the profession of civil engineers, about insurance, about how it works in the other countries. So, for example, as far as I know, there are countries where there is just one category of civil engineers. But this is not the case of Italy or Latvia, for example. So, for example, in Austria, a civil engineer, when he is a civil engineer, can do everything that has to do with construction. Can go to the site, can be supervisor, can be also this reviewer, can be designer, or can be anything. And it was like this also once in Italy. Also in Cyprus and in Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Hungary, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Malta, Switzerland. There is just one category. In Bulgaria, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, Italy, Latvia, Poland, Portugal, Slovenia, Slovakia, Spain, and the United Kingdom, there are different categories. So these are divided because the engineers can either do their activities just in some specific areas, or they are limited for some kind of things. As I will say also later, for example, in Italy, after this Bologna reform that happened many years ago because of this CTS system is for the university. So you are not the same engineer if you just studied, of course, 3 years and you have the bachelor, or if you studied 5 years. So we have two different sections in the chamber of civil engineers. And those that just studied 3 years, they are not allowed to make complex calculations or to do some kind of things. Also, we call them, not we call them, it is the official name by the chamber, junior engineer, so that nobody in this should also sign themselves junior. So that is something that nobody, I have never seen nobody signing himself junior, because I think it's not really nice as a thing. I would like to have a confirmation by you. Actually, in Latvia, you have 5 different categories for engineers. Is that right? So you have a water technology civil engineer, transport building civil engineer, building civil engineer, hydrotechnical construction civil engineer, and heating and gas civil engineer. Is that right? You have more. Okay. And anyways, one engineer that do something in one usually don't do anything in the other sector. Now, in Italy and in those countries there, so if you are at least the engineer that you studied 5 years, you're allowed to do everything you want in every one of these. So, and also you don't have any problems. I think you also have a distinction for the designers and the engineers that go to the site. In Italy, no, I go to the site, but I also make the design. So it's not, you are not limited in this kind of things. In some other countries, like in the United Kingdom, there are things that are reserved for field of activities, like for reservoir, for aviation and nuclear related facilities. This is our, also in Denmark and in Slovakia, for specialized energy engineers can assess energy performance of buildings. So in Italy, it's not really like this. In Italy, I am theoretically allowed to make energy assessment of buildings, even though usually we don't do that. But just because it's not our business somehow. But if one wants, of course, can do it. Of course, it has to be competent on these kind of things. But it's not this is one thing, but you will see later there are also places where you don't even need to be graduated to be engineer. This is also the case of England. This is also something that is always reminded in this kind of presentation. So in Spain, also are different. There are two types of civil engineers. Ingeniero de caminos e canales y puertos, that is master of engineering, so an engineer that studied 5 years at least, that has a full professional competence in civil engineering and public works, and ingeniero técnicos de obras públicas, that is restricted to one of these specialities, that is civil construction, hydraulic, or transport, and cannot do some of the others. This is also something that is probably very complicated with this Erasmus system. When you go to study to another, to go to Spain or to another university somewhere else, they have specialization courses that are completely different than the one that you find in your country. So I think maybe it would be nice to have a common way to do that, even though I don't know which one is the best one, and maybe they are trying to go in this direction, but they're not so far yet. For the construction of private buildings and the intervention of a civil engineer is not required, for example. In the United Kingdom, the only professionals which activities reserved by law are engineers in the field of reservoir, aviation, and nuclear-related facilities. This is something that I was already saying. This is also something that I was saying before. In some member states, the distinction is made between design and construction. So like advising, supervision, coordination, check of conformity, and all these project management activities that you are probably doing on site, these are one kind of engineer. The one that makes a calculation, that draws plans, and so on, are another category. For example, this is true in Denmark, Finland, also in your country, in Latvia, in Slovenia, in Slovakia. In Denmark, the designer is only regulated if he makes something, a category of buildings that are high hazard risk. For example, nuclear station, I think, or very high buildings probably. I'm not sure about what is the definition of high hazard risk, but it should be something like this. A building surveyor is the one authorized to prepare a report on house conditions, and a building site coordinator, okay, that regards the health and safety on construction sites. So they are different things that are regulated separately. Then there is actually a distinction based on levels of responsibility. Also more than levels of responsibility on professional experience or qualifications. This is true also in Italy. I told you this, actually we have the section A, the master degree, the complete tasks they can do, actually, as I told you before, everything. And those are registered under section B, bachelor degree, the professional body register. For example, until 15 years ago, so it was so that once you become an engineer, not only you can do everything you want in the civil engineering sector, but in Italy you could do everything also like electrical engineer. Once you were civil engineer or engineer and inscribed to the chamber, you had theoretically, even though nobody did it, of course, because if you study civil engineering, you are going to make a civil engineering, but at that time, actually, engineers were apparently able to do more than now. So in Bulgaria, designers are restricted to according to their capability and the type of building size. Probably this is related to the experience that they have, how many years experience, or if they have references about these projects. They cannot do probably bridges if they never designed a bridge before, or at least they have to be part of the design calculation for another company or something like this. In Denmark, yeah, I told you before is for this category of high hazard risk. In Lithuania, they need a specific authorization in case of exceptional significance, so like in Denmark. In Poland, activities with a restricted or full capacity can access to designing construction with a different kind of capacity. In Slovenia, responsible project designers are responsible managers of work, are authorized to work on more complex structure depending on the length, the professional experience. That actually sounds also reasonable. In Italy, I told you already, it depends on how much in the end you studied. In Portugal, there are two categories of civil engineers with different levels of responsibility. And this is also the case with 5 years education or just smaller. That is actually also something that is reasonable. This is actually something that may be complicated a little bit if an engineer from Austria wants to come to Latvia to work, because in Austria, yeah, an engineer can do everything as a civil engineer, and it's not clear if he moves to Latvia what kind of works he is allowed to do. Actually, I also think that before starting with the profession, you have to follow some kind of heater to be able to work also in Latvia. At least it is, if I want to sign a project in Austria, first I have to call the Chamber of Austrian Engineers and ask them to, or provide them the necessary documentation to tell them that I had the necessary experience. But for example, Civil Technica in Austria, actually not only he can perform both tasks on the construction work, on the construction site, or in office as a designer. He has to do that. He has to have at least 1 year experience in designing and 2 years, or the opposite, maybe 2 years in designing and 1 year on the site. Otherwise, you cannot be a Civil Technica. And if you are not a Civil Technica, you cannot have your company as an engineer, and you cannot sign any project. And of course, you cannot also be this reviewer for projects. You, of course, can work as an engineer in another office as an employee. Yeah. Certain member states regulate the profession by reserves of activities linked to professional qualification requirements, meaning that a service provider cannot exercise the profession unless he has the qualification required or a qualification recognized as equivalent. Other member states regulate the profession with regard to the title. So this is true also in Italy. We will see it later. So, for example, yeah, in Italy you cannot be engineer unless you are inscribed in the Chamber of Engineers. Otherwise, it's not possible that you are, and you cannot also sign yourself as an engineer unless you are. In Belgium, in France, in Germany, in Ireland, and the United Kingdom legally protect the use of the professional title. This means that actually you can work as an engineer, but you cannot sign yourself engineer unless you are inscribed in the Chamber of Engineers. But this doesn't mean much. In France, yeah, actually, this is also said that this is real in theory, but in practice, to access to the public, this means to the public employment, they usually request that you are actually engineer to do that. So it means that in the end, theoretically, it is possible to not be it, but in fact, in the end, you have to be it anyways. In France, the title protected is ingénieur diplômé. However, engineers in the public service are not necessarily ingénieur diplômé, and there is no regulation regarding a title or a qualification in order to sign an official document. In general, engineers are employees and the responsibility for the signature is with the company. This is actually true also in Austria and in Italy. So it's only required that the boss of the company has the signature, and you can work for them as an engineer, even in some cases if you are not an engineer. Yeah, in the United Kingdom, the legally protected titles, member of the Institution of Civil Engineers and Chartered Civil Engineers, along with Engineering Council Registration and Charter Engineers, these titles may only be used by individuals who are members of this organization and registered with the Engineering Council at the appropriate grade. So this means actually only about using the title. This means that you say an inch before your name. A small number of member states, among which also Italy, Croatia, Cyprus, Malta, and Portugal, and Spain, not only will regulate the profession, but also protect the use of the title. This means that you cannot work as an engineer unless you actually are inscribed in this chamber. And that means also many other things, that you finished a study and many other things. You cannot work as an engineer unless you have it. So this means you cannot sign anything, and also in some cases not even work as an engineer or make tasks or sign documents for another company unless you actually are engineer inscribed to this chamber. In Portugal, has reported that due to fraudulent activity, a specific declaration system has been introduced for the engineer-technicals by the national professional body. This is somehow something that the chambers of engineers developed among Europe in some countries as a kind of protection, so to protect the profession in the end. So in Italy, engineers, they believe to become engineer is difficult. Then, so if you want to work as an engineer, you have to make sure you did everything right. It's not for everybody. But this is not true in all the countries. For example, I will show it in the next slide, but maybe, yeah. So all member states, in the end, I mean about European states, they require an academic qualification to perform the profession of civil engineer. But this doesn't mean that it has to be a university. For example, a higher education is required in these following countries that are Austria, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Italy, with different bachelor 3 years for section B and masters for the other one. Germany, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Liechtenstein, Poland, Romania, Denmark, Luxembourg, Slovakia, Greece, Croatia, Hungary, Portugal, and Slovenia. But this is not the case in the United Kingdom, for example, and also in some other countries. In the United Kingdom, actually, you can work as an engineer and also inscribe yourself in the Chamber of Engineers, even if you never studied at a university. So there is a specific regime in the way that the qualification of civil engineers is based on the assessment of competence to an internationally recognized standard, which is open to anyone that can demonstrate that they have met those standards, regardless how this competence has been acquired. That means that actually, if you show that you are able to work as an engineer, in the UK you can work as an engineer. So it's not really clear how you learned to do that, but this means that it is possible for someone that has left the school at 16 years with no formal academic qualification to acquire somehow this competence and then work as a chartered engineer later in his life. In Poland, actually, you need actually to be a technician or a master craftsman or a diploma at the level of the technician, but you don't need a university for that. In Finland, also accept persons who do not have any qualifications required, but skills are considered adequate. So, not really clear what this means, but in Czech Republic and Slovakia and Finland, is open to those holding secondary education. This means high school in the end. Also, to sign projects in Austria, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, also in Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Slovenia, Poland, Finland, and United Kingdom, you also need to show that you had experience. This is true, for example, in Austria. You cannot make the exam as a Civiltechnica unless you show that you worked at least 3 years, 2 in the design and 1 on the construction site. This is how it works in Austria. In Italy, you don't need that. You actually can make, here is probably that a professional examination is required to become an engineer. But in Austria, for example, this professional examination is done after you show that you had the experience. In Italy, you can make it theoretically the day after you finish university. You can take this examination that is actually very practical. So usually people anyways work a little bit before making it, but many do it right away after the university. And after that, they are theoretically able to sign projects, even though also in this case, in practice is never going to happen because they don't do that. In the following member states, a professional examination is required to become an engineer. So Austria, Croatia, Greece, Italy, Malta, Slovenia, Poland, and Slovakia. But I think in Latvia you don't have necessarily to do that, or just for some kind of professions. So you don't have a state exam. You have. Okay, then this information is not correct. In Italy, of course, we have, in Austria also, but in some other countries like Germany, you don't have it. You can, you don't have it. In some member states, there is an authorization certification for some professional categories in Denmark, Lithuania, and Czech Republic. And this was actually about the distinctions and the certifications of civil engineers. Now, I will start speaking a little bit about the liability, because this is also something that is different among states. So, for example, so you know, and it is like this, and in Italy and Austria is very severe as well. So the professional liability is very important thing for an engineer. So because in almost all EU countries, there is a principle that the consulting engineer can held jointly and severally liable, which means that any single defendant who is held jointly and severally liable may be requested to pay 100% of the damages. And the defendant who paid as recourse against the other jointly and severally liable defendant to their portion of the damages, but bears the risk of their insolvency. So if they don't have money to pay in the end. So in the other words, if one of the jointly and severely liable contractors or consulting engineers goes bankrupt, the client can oblige one of them or the others to pay, even when their share of the damage is small. This, in theory, means that even if you make a calculation for 2,000 euro for a project that is 2 million, if something goes wrong and the construction company go bankrupt, and the other one go bankrupt, and the other one go bankrupt too, and somebody die and somebody has to pay, in theory, you are responsible. You can be responsible if they find out that something in the calculation was wrong. Maybe it was also something else wrong in the construction, or maybe the reviewer didn't check, or maybe the supervision didn't check as well. But there was a problem in the calculation. In that case, you are responsible. In Italy, also the structural design reviewer and the construction supervisor, they are also severely liable. They share the liability. And in fact, what happens usually in Italy, in practice, it is like this. More or less, the damages in case of problems, they are shared. Depending on how much was your amount of works in this project. This is how it works in practice. That is not actually what can theoretically happen. So these are examples of very big damages that can happen. And after all of this, actually, I found also very surprising that not in all the state member countries, it is mandatory to have an insurance. It's not. So, for example, also in Austria, in Czech Republic, in Deutschland, so in Germany, it's not necessary theoretically to have an insurance. So, mandatory professional liability insurance is not necessary. We will see then that actually usually it's the client that asks you to have an insurance. So in the end, you must have it anyways, but it's not required by law. In Italy it is. Actually, in Italy and also in Latvia, you have to have the insurance. But in Finland, in Greece, in Hungary, some other countries, actually, you see that the professional liability is not necessary in theory. Also, in Romania, in Poland, no, in Portugal, what is here, in Sweden, in Norway, in some countries, actually, it's not legally necessary that an engineer that signs projects has an insurance. Some national rules dictate whether consulting civil engineers are obliged to insure their professional liability. Several countries have no statutory requirement or the duty to maintain any insurance. For example, this is the case, I was saying before, Austria, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Hungary, Germany, England, or Ireland. Anyways, as I was saying before, is the contract usually that forces you to have an insurance. In Denmark, it's not necessary by law. However, all standard conditions of contract require the consulting firm to be insured. However, it is not possible to generalize how much, which depends on the project. the duration of the cover is generally 5 years following the handover of the building, 10 years in case of private customers. In the Netherlands, otherwise, there is no obligation for a consulting firm to have insurance. However, Netherlands engineers members are required to carry insurance cover for at least 1 million. NL engineers are those engineers that are inscribed in the chamber. And so in the end, if you are not able to work in Netherlands unless you are inscribed, in the end you have to do the insurance anyways. So you see that actually in several countries, also here, in Finland, so the contract conditions for construction projects for consulting engineers, they use standard conditions like those ones that you can find in FIDIC, and everybody use that. So if you use that, it is prescribed that actually you have to have an insurance. This is the same also in Norway. The general conditions you can find here, those one also impose a duty to be insured. The limit for the liability according to these general conditions is 150 price-based amounts. That is actually more or less 1.2 million euro. I think in Italy is less. You can have so something like 500,000 euro. But 500,000 euro is very low. How much is it here in Latvia, actually? There is an amount? 150,000 is minimum. Actually, something happens, it doesn't cover very much, also 500,000. Yeah. Depends on what actually you are, what kind of projects. In member states where no mandatory insurance is imposed by any statute, the contractual provision often require the consulting engineers to take out insurance. In Sweden, yeah, also here, is the same as in Finland and in Norway. So here also is €500,000 euro, and also, yeah, in this case is renewable on a yearly basis. If the contractor requires insurance with an insurance amount earmarked for one specific project, the consultant can subscribe to special project insurance. In most of the cases, the client sets a higher amount than 120 base amounts, and this is almost always that who pays the insurance, even if the consultant is the one that pays the insurance. So in this case, in Sweden, that actually is something not bad. The insurance is paid by the client. So if the client wants to make some kind of structure, he pays for the insurance and not the consultant. That is actually not the Italian system. In Italy, all the professionals, also all the engineers, they pay the insurance by themselves, and can actually be a big amount. Yeah, in England and in Ireland, where standard form of contract governing the relations between the client and the consulting engineer also generally require the consulting engineer to be insured. In Ireland, actually, it is 30 million yeah, for general firms to maintain a minimum cover of 30 million, any one occurrence and unlimited in the period of insurance. Probably this is due to the fact that Ireland consulting engineers, they usually work in big offices or big firms, but this is not the case, for example, in Italy, because in Italy it's very usual to have a group of engineers that are just 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 people that work together, and not 100 people that work in the same office on the same project. This depends on how actually it is organized in the single states. There are also some countries that you not only don't have you don't have to be insured by law, but there are also no such conditions in the general contracts, and these it is less frequent. Yeah, let's say, that they have this kind of conditions in the contract. This is, for instance, the case of Belgium, Turkey, and Hungary. However, even in these countries, there is a growing tendency for contracts to stipulate a duty on the consulting engineers to be insured, especially in case of public works and large projects. But in this case, they make every time differently. They have no standard conditions. They have no, And also in France, where the client often demands a decennial, so an insurance for 10 years, also the constructions exempted of the compulsory insurance. However, this is the problem that I also read. So the market does not offer such insurance because it is too long. So the consulting firms generally have 2 annual insurance, one that is that has a limit guarantee of 3 million and a professional liability insurance to cover all kinds of liability exempt for the decennial liability. So they have also kind of problems in stipulate this kind of insurance because actually they don't have the possibility to do in once, although actually the law require it. In Germany, most consulting engineers are in fact covered by a professional liability insurance. This is actually reasonable because everybody wants to make it first for himself. This is especially the case for the consulting engineers who intend to act as an architect because actually the Bundesarchitektenkammer needs for the inscription to have the professional liability insurance, although actually the engineers not. The same applies to Austria, where actually I never met any Austrian engineer that doesn't have an insurance, of course, but it's interesting to see that it's actually not really required. This insurance is normally not connected with a certain project, but is a general coverage up to a certain liability sum. Of course, the necessary minimum insurance sum that is required from the consulting engineer by the client often depends on the size and complexity of the project. This is true also in Italy. So our company have a professional liability company that covers everything until an amount of 10 million or whatever. And of course, if we join bigger projects or that they require an extra one, you make actually an upgrade of your liability insurance that actually is already pretty much high. So then something that is more related to what I saw in my experiences in last years in the various countries I was, that actually I was for a while in Serbia. Actually in Serbia I was kind of surprised because the engineers were very, very skilled, actually, especially in those calculations by hand. Not only actually those engineers with whom I was working in the project, but actually, so the work there was actually to redesign, to remake the calculation of some kind of 15 steel bridges in Montenegro. And actually I was surprised because all the calculations were made by that time in the 1955 by hand without any mistake, and all the plans were very perfectly drawn. And even though I didn't understand much about what was written because of the alphabet, it was written in Cyrillic and so. So it was interesting to see that actually we used kind of the same system using influence lines to find out which members were more stressed, and actually we found out actually more or less the same solution they had. In Serbia, actually, usually work that you have a technical director in the project that is very important and usually very old person. In that case, it was a guy, a very competent guy. His name is Cvetkovic. That was the technical director of all the project, and he was supervising everything, and he built most of the bridges in Belgrade as well. He was an exquisite person, really, and he was actually giving advices to the team of engineers that were performing calculations, also with very modern systems, actually using complex software and anything. And but it was a kind of different than the system we have also in Italy or in Austria. In that project, actually, one single person was checking somehow and actually managing all the team of engineers, and everything was passing through him. He was also checking calculations or also technical parts of reports and review, but somehow it was working. Also about Serbia, I remember some kind of stories about some meetings I had with the engineers there. Although, yeah, they were very competent. I remember. So in Serbia, for example, many people smoke. So, and this is something that it was surprising for me, because you enter in an office in Serbia and you can't even see because it's full of smoke and everybody is smoking also during the meeting. This is something that is impossible to see in Austria, for example. So in Austria it's banned to smoke, but in Germany and in Italy even more. It's not allowed to smoke, of course, in the office. And yeah, I remember these occasions and also the meetings. So also that the engineers in Serbia are kind of less. So in Austria, let's say, engineers are used to stay in very comfortable and chic and modern offices, and in that case, no. Even though actually the work was done. Actually with the same level of quality, actually, so it was a very simple location that at the beginning was surprising me. Something else about maybe Italian structural engineers, Italian structural engineers when they finish university. Also, I studied half of the time in Italy and half of the time in Austria. And even though, so you cannot generalize, but Austrians are much more practical and the Italians are much more theoretical. When they finish to study, so you take an Italian engineer and he can maybe integrate by hand any kind of equation, but he cannot design a beam. And an Austrian engineer is different because in some cases he doesn't have the skills in mathematics or cannot program anything, but actually they know the Eurocode. So in each page, this is also something that I experienced. Then actually in India is something also different. So even though here in Europe, more or less, engineers are pretty much qualified, in India you can find an employee that is extremely qualified and is able to do everything by himself better than a German one, but is not really the case. Usually you have an office and it's not really that engineers are not qualified, but they look like less motivated. As I will also say later here, usually in India you need for tendering also an external Western consultant. Otherwise, you don't get the construction project. This is something that most of the construction companies like IRCON need. So you always have usually a German or an Italian or somebody from a consulting engineer from another country that is actually the technical manager for an office of Indian companies. And there, actually, you can see that many times you give a task to do to someone, but this one take it and give it to somebody else to do, that give it to another one, to another one, and to another one, and in the end, so it comes back something, you know, that is wrong, and you check it and say, it is wrong. What did you do? Ah, he didn't do it, he did. And then he did, and then you go back to somebody that did it, but it is somehow a thing that is more cultural, maybe still based on this caste system that they have in India. There's a kind of funny things, and also stories about, yeah, you know, in India, cows are so sacred. So actually, if they pass the road, nobody touch them, and you can stand there in line for hours waiting that the cows are passing the road. So these are kind of experiences we collected in the last years. So now actually they ask us, somebody of us, to go there for a period of 6 months, but we are trying to find somebody that wants to go, because it's not really something that everybody wants to do by himself. So from today to tomorrow, even though it's a cool experience, but let's see. In Austria, I have to say, and actually we work pretty much in Austria, the engineering companies don't work many hours. I don't know how it is here in Latvia, but it's very usual in Austria, and in Germany I know it's not the same. So everybody stops to work every day at 5 p.m. and every Friday at lunchtime everybody go home. So Friday afternoon, Saturday and Sunday nobody work in Austria. This is something that in Italy is not known, because in many cases, also in cases of deadlines, you work also all the night and also all the weekend if it is needed. So, and also I think in Serbia it was the same, especially when we were closing the project and we were close to the deadline. So this is something that also is cultural related. And actually I think in some cases Austrians are more efficient because they don't have so much time. So then they make things faster. In Italy, sometimes it's like this, that you don't want to show that you are the first one to go away, so then you stay there also if you don't have anything to do sometimes. So this is also a problem. Then bureaucracy, I found out, yeah, maybe related to this thing that Italy needs, in some cases, especially in construction, to be checked twice, is a problem, because it slows down very much the projects. This is something that actually, yeah, we are trying to solve, but otherwise, yeah, we have a lot of norms. Also before, actually, we have a specification for almost all things that can happen. This, yeah, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not good, because if you have too many norms, then it's difficult to apply them, or you have some norms that are not really easy to apply, you know, all the conditions. So then it's also difficult to handle. So then another thing that in this project in Austria, for example, although we are in Austria, so the construction companies are mostly Italians. It is a joint venture of Austrian and Italian companies. And the Austrians engineers, they always make fun, because Italians discuss about the contract for months. So like if you have to discuss about a contract in Austria takes maximum 1 week, and they use everything standard. They have a standard form of contract, and you just sign it, and everybody trusts that. So in Italy, contracts are usually so thick, and nobody read it, but there are so lawyers of every company that work on it for months. It was 1 page of addendum, contractual addendum to sign, and this took actually for this project, it took more than 2 months, and continual reviews and continuous meetings. I don't know, maybe in Italy actually everybody think that the other part is trying to cheat, and this is something that in Austria or in Germany is not really usual. It's something that is very different. Yeah, in Austria also, but also in Italy, so this QA or QM system is taken very seriously. So this means that this double checking internally, also to have this ISO 9000, so 9001 certification, is very important. You have to show that you work that way. So the inspector comes and checks all the reports you made in the last months or years and check that everyone checked and signed, and you have actually a reviewal internal certification system, or a QM system, as we are actually used to call it. And also the figure of the external design reviewer is very important. In some other countries, like in India, they have a similar way. They actually want to double check it, but it's not really legally organized. So then it is also one of the reasons why they always want to have a Western consultant for that. So they try to redistribute the liability to the people of the tender. You make it checking by each one twice, by all your engineers, by the designers, and then finally you actually you actually get to the solution. But it's not so well organized, let's say. Yeah, something more. Also, this is related for Austrian construction companies and Italian construction companies. So I found out that in Austria, the risk for the execution of a job is much, much, much less than in Italy. And that is probably why actually in Italy there are not so many small companies that still work after the crisis of some years ago. There remained this big Salini in Pregilo and some others, because the conditions are usually very bad in BOQs. So for example, the geotechnical risk is usually in Italy of the construction company. This means, for example, they are making now the BBT, the Brenner Basis tunnel, close to my region from Italy to Austria. They are excavating a very long tunnel, and since it is on the border, half of it is in Italy, half of it is in Austria. And there are 2 different tenders and 2 different BOQs and 2 different contracts, and the conditions are completely different. In Italy, Impregilo is making it, and it has all the risks. So this means that if instead of sand they find a rock, they don't get any money extra for that. So they may fail, or they may go bankrupt, but they are not getting any extra money for that unless they go to the court or they do some extra things. In Austria, otherwise, they have a system that, in my opinion, is much better on the point of view of the construction companies, because they have very detailed BOQs. They have things for everything. So they have like specification. So, okay, in tendering phase, it's very difficult to make the prices because you have pages and pages and pages of BOQs, but you have everything for anything that can happen. So if you have idle times, if you have water, if you have a geotechnical risk, if you have anything, it's already described how much money you get, and you also get it in the end if it happens. So this is much better for the for the construction companies because they don't go bankrupt in Austria. It is less good for the country because usually they have to pay more money, but I think it is fair somehow. Yeah, and also it is better because the projects always get finished. It is not the case in Italy, for example, that are many projects that begin but never end, because of these problems. Yeah, and also this is about the payment. In Austria, I don't know how it is here in Latvia, but in Austria and Germany, you always, if it is a public contract, it is common in every public contract. You get the money after 30 days of the invoice. In Italy, it's very not unusual that you get the money 6 months after you make the work, but this is regulated by contract like this. But this means, of course, that if Impregilo has to excavate the Brenner Basis tunnel, he has to go out in 6 months of 20 million euro. And there begin to be more banks instead of construction companies because they have to anticipate a lot of money, pay people for 6 months, and this is the reason why usually actually construction companies in Italy are much bigger, and also they care much more, they carry much more risk than in other countries. And yeah, this was more or less the end for me. It was the end of the presentation, and any kind of questions are welcome on any topic. Thank you very much.
Hello. I have a question about the previous part of your presentation. Okay. About you said that if there are significant change in design, then this design reviewer must check this significant change in design. But what in your practice is significant change? For example, if I change 2 bars of diameter 12 millimeters to 1 bar of diameter 20 millimeters, is it significant or not? What is significant?
Yeah, I bring you 2 examples. One time, actually, for a project in Austria, they didn't have one kind of E-beam to put in part of a tunnel because they had to use a channel, but they didn't have it on the site. Then they asked, can we take this one and cut it in 2 and use this one? This is maybe not significant, and the beam that they actually used was much bigger and better than the other one. So this is not significant, okay? But they ask us as a designer, and also we call the reviewer to ask if it was okay to make this change, but of course it was okay. But there are also some other cases, like in India. I remember they were not doing the insulation of a tunnel, although they had to do it, and nobody said anything to anybody. And so we just went there, and we checked that, and there was nothing there. And of course, we had to inform the reviewer in that case. So what is significant, so for example, if you want to make a hole in a floor, of course you have to ask the reviewer. So anything I would say that affects the structure. Also, in some cases, I would say, because it's not always like this, that if you change maybe the type of concrete you are using. In some cases, you are using a concrete that is much better, you think, that you use maybe a 50-60 instead of 20-25, and you think it's better. But then actually, the structure works differently because it's stiffer, maybe one pillar instead of the others. So depends on the case. Anything that actually is relevant under a structural point of view, I think at least the designer should be informed. And if the designer thinks that is relevant, also the the reviewer should be informed.
Any other questions? Šis kungs ir tuvāk, drīkst vispirms viņam.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I have got one question. When I have been abroad and when I had my internship, so I took a look at estimates, and for example, in the United States and England, an average profit for a construction project is around 20 to 30%.
Yeah.
But here in Latvia, I have seen 3, 5%, 7% sometimes. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for us how to make our projects more profitable.
So, yeah, good question. So, are you asking for the construction company how much profit they make on the construction? Yeah. Actually, in Austria and in Italy, the profit with the one that you calculate the prices you make for a tender is about 25–30%. So this is very, very much. But actually, you have to consider, usually you calculate like this, that you have internal costs due to your organization, like you have rental costs, you have all the administrative people that work on tendering, and this is usually between 10 and 15, and the rest is actually profit. For designing, actually usually is less, because you don't have actually all these expenses, and you, I think 3 or 4 or 5 or 7% is reasonable. Also for this project there, I think we were discussing before, the designing is around 5% for the design, but the amount actually of the costs, about this I would say the profit anyways lies 20–25%. So actually, are you sure that you make just 3% on the projects and you are able to? So you mean the percentage on the amount of the works, or you mean the profit that you calculate internally on the? No, just the amount of the tender. You mean 3% is the amount? Yeah. Usually you should increase about 5. Yeah, because it's an important. You see what happens if something will go wrong. You should convince the client that it's important to have a proper design, and it has to pay more for it. Yeah, this is my advice. Yeah.
One question, if you don't mind,
yeah.
Maybe partially related to the margin and profits, about geotechnical risks.
Yeah.
You said that you design tunnels, and of course it includes geotechnics. And also you mentioned that there is a headache, as I understood, with monitoring in Italy.
Yeah.
So monitoring is not so simple thing on the geotechnical monitoring.
Yeah.
Why is it so in Italy?
Actually, this is a good question, and actually the reason is mainly because the highway companies in Italy, they tend to don't make a supervision. Supervision is expensive, and they usually don't pay for that, or they pay too late, and then so there is not really such controls, but it's changing because of this project, of course. In tunneling, it is different. Usually in every tunnel is installed a monitoring system that looks for settlements of the tunnel, and this is actually kind of standard in in Austria, but also in Italy. About this, I wanted to say something because we are working now on a very interesting project, not for a tunnel, but for a bridge, but is something that you can apply also for tunneling, for a bridge that they are building now in Austria. We are going to make interactive monitoring system. So they are now installing the sensors inside, during construction, inside the bridge. And then our company is going to develop, using WeStatics, our platform, we are going to make a digital twin. So like a model, a finite element model that auto-updates on the measured quantities, on the values that you get from the structure. This is like a R&D project, and let's see if it is going to work, fine. But I think in the future, something like that should be made. And in my opinion also, so we proposed this solution for a test, both in Austria and both in Italy. And this is kind of funny because Italian administration say no, but Austrians say yes. And so in Italy, after this big problem they just had, I would have expected that they invest more on this thing. But it was not like this. I think it's more related to the system and to availability of resources for these kind of things in the two different countries. I hope I answered to your question.
Not completely, but maybe maybe I can ask more.
Okay.
Speaking about that percent of the design expenses from the whole sum of the construction.
Yeah.
So we here have 1%. In
1%?
1%, yes. I
Okay.
think everybody agree with me. Is it okay in your opinion? You said you have 5.
I say in that project there, in that project of the bridge, I know it is 5. But I also know that the structural calculation is very complicated. In that case, it's 5 and you can allow it. So we usually, for tunneling and for these kind of things, we don't do everything by ourselves because many parts of the projects and also the signature and also the monitoring and also the reporting and these kind of things that are done by another company. And I can say that our prices are less than 1%, of course, but we also cooperate with other companies. But I think, anyways, if I think correctly, that less than 3-4% is not possible. Also 5, depending on where you are doing that. You must consider that usually these companies that make tunneling or this, an advice that maybe I can give to you is much more profitable to go sometimes in other countries, like in India, because there they need somebody that is able and has this technology and has experiences and references to do tunneling. It is also a very difficult task, and they pay more for that. It's just this. If it wouldn't be like this, of course, in Austria it's much more expensive to design, also because it's also more expensive than in Italy because salaries are much higher, and so I see more that these companies, they try to design in other countries and to make more profit in this way. So also the risk maybe is higher, of course, because you always have problems to get paid. Also, this is a problem. But I think 5% is not too high for some kind of projects.
Yes.
Also, I wanted to tell you, just a reviewer in Italy, he gets between 0.5 and 3% of the construction cost, just a reviewer for some kind of things. So this is also 0.5, of course, depends on the amount of the works. So if it is a bridge of many million euros, he gets even less than 0.5%. But if it is just a house, it gets usually 3%. Also in Germany and Austria. Yeah.
Okay, may I ask one more question? I'm not sure that I understood how extensively you are connected with geotechnics, but are you happy with geotechnical investigation and geotechnical knowledge? What geotechnical investigators give to you as a designer? So are you happy with geotechnical investigation in your country?
Usually not, because you never get exactly the parameters you want to have. In the end, you always get, so first, in every country. So it's never really clearly explained because it's the 4 eyes principle. Nobody wants to take the responsibility to 100%. But I remember this is a very difficult part in every time that we are designing a tunnel, because they send you a lot of information designed with this rock class index, but in the end you don't have what you need, that is actually the megapascal and the cohesion and the friction angle and these kind of parameters that you need to make the calculation. But nobody is going to give you. So in the end you have to extrapolate them from what you get, from literature, from these, from the other thing, get an assumption, and maybe in many cases to get a high value and a lower value and perform many calculations, and then, yeah, of course, you write the reports, and in the reports there is always a disclaimer that says we are doing the best we can with the parameters we got, and if something changes on site, so the construction company must inform immediately the design, and the design must be repeated. This is how we usually do that. But you are right, actually the parameters, the geotechnical parameters are often difficult to get from the investigation, especially in India. For this tunneling project, it was one borehole every kilometer. So this is not enough to get information about the soil, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And you make monitoring to be on the safe side. If something happens, you can see what does happen.
I hope so, yeah. So it's the first time we do such a kind of project. So, but you mean in the tunnel? With
yes.
Yeah, in the tunnel we were never responsible. There are specified companies, but this is very, very usual procedure. You have laser pointers that can measure the displacement of the vault, and of course you get settlements if they happen. They are used also during the construction, and this kind of usual. Yeah.
Okay.
Paldies kolēģiem par daudzajiem jautājumiem. Ļausim arī citam kādu jautājumu uzdot.
Hello. One more question about the pricing of structural design works. What would you say if you have a typical experience in typical structural design of buildings or something similar? What is the case in Italy in variance of pricing of design works between companies? Are they all pricing the structural design works at the same level, around those 4 or 5%, or do you see a huge variance in the proposals for the works between companies?
Yeah, in many cases they are variable. You get very different. In many cases you ask for some offers, and you get different prices. Usually, yes. Usually, designing in Austria is much more expensive. I can say the biggest companies, the biggest consulting engineers that do design in Italy, they calculate around 35 euro per hour per each engineer that works on something when they calculate how much to make an offer. This is one of the lowest, but it's not unusual that they calculate with 50 euro per hour. In Austria, it's more, usually it's 70 or something like this when they make an offer. Of course, this is for the employees, I mean, that work on a project.
But would you say that it is normal to see an offer that differ by a factor of 2 or something?
Yeah, I saw it many times. So also for many things in engineering, it can happen that you have half. Then usually before taking the cheapest one, you check, or you look for references, or at least you make clear that if they understood what you asked them. Yeah. This is always.
Vēl kāds jautājums? Tagad man ir veseli 2 mikrofoni. Jā, lūdzu.
A small remark, perhaps the problem in Italy with the quality monitoring lies for the highways with the problem of oligarchs. Still, perhaps part of highways still belong to Berlusconi type guys.
Yes, maybe. Yeah. Actually, in that case, I think is another. So you maybe know Benetton?
Yeah, that's another family.
Yeah, but they are responsible for the highways in Italy. And now the government says something, they want to take away their license. Really, I cannot say who is responsible for that. But of course, so I have this opportunity to see how things work in Austria and how things work in Italy. And I was in a presentation some weeks ago of a colleague that although he's South Tyrolean, he makes a lot of inspections of bridges in Italy. And in central or south of Italy, bridges are really in very bad conditions. And last week I was making how can I say? I was checking actually a structure from the 1980s in Austria. And I was there with a group of civil engineers from Italy, and the structure was perfect in such conditions that I never. It's impossible to see a crack in a pylon. So actually, one of the engineers say it looks like this in Italy after 1 week or after 2 weeks. This is something that. I don't know why, but actually that tender is also about making improvements to make maintenance of these pillars. I think it's taken more seriously in other countries than in Italy, and I really hope that Italy do something for this. Of course, it's also related to the budget to do that. Of course, it's also a topic. Yeah.
One small question. This was actually not a question. The one about you as designers. Is it mandatory by law in Austria or Italy to invite you to participate during the construction process? I don't know if it's the client or the construction company who hires you to make changes in the design or to supervise. Do you have author supervision? Do you go to site as authors of design and to look after the construction company? Is it mandatory by law to cooperate with the same company that has designed a project, or is it easy to kick out the designers and invite others?
This can be. It's easy to kick out, actually. In some cases, also in the stages, it's very often that the preliminary design is done by another company than the one that make the technical, or usually those that make the technical also make the detailed engineering. But yeah, and many times also during the project, it's often so. Actually, also if you find out that some changes are necessary, it's not unusual that you ask the opinion to many consultants and then you take the best one. So the client do that. Yeah, it's possible.
The liability lies with the last one who has touched the design.
Yeah, you have to discuss about it. A little bit and a little bit, I would say. but you cannot, depends on the case, yeah, of course. Thank you.
Tagad ir. Vēl kādam jautājumi?
One question about bridge design loads in Italy. What's your approach in Italy for design loads to old bridge recalculations? For example, from 50, 60-year-old bridges. Are you using Eurocodes as well for those bridges?
Actually not. In Italy, actually we have this standard, this NTC, these norme tecniche per le costruzioni, and it is used that especially for bridges, especially for also buildings, because I maybe didn't say it, but in Italy the earthquake analysis is mandatory for all buildings, and most of the renewal you have to make on bridges and so is just to put them either to adapt them to the traffic that you have now, or to put it in safety because of earthquake. But we usually almost 100% we design everything with NTC also because NTCs are much more detailed than the Eurocode. Yeah.
It means you have some special design loads for all bridges, yes?
For Italy, yes. For Italy is prevalent on the Eurocode.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
The question is if reconstruction allows for lower loads than new build bridge?
Yes. This, yes. Yes. Actually, in some cases, I was involved in a project where, so if actually you can certify that the loads that you have are lower, okay, or that actually you don't have the deflection you calculated because the quality of the materials are good, or if you have information about the traffic, about the loads, you can consider actually lower actually partial combination factors to make the design. This is allowed, 100%. We don't work that much with old bridges, but I went to a very interesting meeting about the engineers that are doing this for all the region in South Tyrol, and they explained exactly this. So they use reduced factors that take also account of possible problems in the structure sometimes, but also take account of the real loads and the real geometry also of the structure. So yes, of course you can do that.
But so in reality, then they check for the real loads to use them in calculations. They do not. These loads are not prescribed in your standards as of to differentiate a situation where you have a new bridge you are proposing to be built and or a reconstruction of an old bridge. These lower values of load values are not prescribed. It's just an option that you can test for them and use them in the calculations.
So there is actually in the NTC a factor that is the parameter of actually knowledge about what you exactly know about this bridge. And this, of course, is very good if you have already built the bridge, because you have all informations. In that case, this is not an extra parameter, but is a factor that you can multiply per your parameter, and that gives to you lower combination factors. This is usually used in maintenance calculations for buildings and bridges. Also, in some cases, so especially for bridges, they had this problem because the traffic now, after 50 years, maybe is not anymore the same with the one that they designed it. So most of the bridges in our region should be demolished and rebuilt if you calculate with the full partial factors. But in some cases, it's much more, it's much cheaper actually to make such a test, a static load test like we were discussing before. So you take the heaviest of the truck you can actually have on this bridge, and you let it pass actually over the bridge, and then you calculate the deflection, and from it you can actually calculate the real resistance of your bridge, and you can also check if it has a plastic deformation or not. And with these, actually, you have material parameters that are known, and in the end, you are allowed then to reduce your partial factors on the resistance of the material, because you prove that it is elastic in the end. And, yeah.
Varbūt vēl kādam ir kāds jautājums? Jā, vēl varbūt kādas pāris jautājumus, un tad teiksim lektoram paldies.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how to tell this. In our opinion, it is very important to make engineers' judgment in many situations. For example, engineer can decrease design factors or to check that loads will be different, and we don't need to demolish this structure, but we can just slowly make some repair or something like this. Sometimes engineer can assume that this time better is to use FIB model code, not Eurocode. Sometimes even he could find that in Eurocode is not so good methodic, and we could use, for example, Canadian engineers' methodics in some fields. And how in many countries, how they are looking on these engineering judgments this way?
This is actually not easy. In Italy, for example, you are with last year we got this new NTC. And actually, before, you were allowed, in some cases, for example, for fiber reinforced concrete, to use another codes. It was written clearly. You can use other international recognized codes or standards for that. And now, actually, although they didn't provide all the necessary tools to do all the calculation, they took it away. So you are not allowed anymore to use the FIB model code, for example. Yeah, this is a problem. Usually what you do in Italy, if you have this kind of problems, but it's already a very big problem, you have to call the ministry. You have to call the ministry and ask them what I do in this case. And it takes 3-4 months, and then you get the answer. So in this particular case, yeah, it's the only thing if you have to build something you can do.
But you get at least some answer after 3 months.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, if you know somebody. It's something that is actually a problem. In some other countries, it's easier. Like in Colombia or in Dominican Republic, you are many times allowed to use which code you want. You can use the American one, the Eurocode, and usually you use the one that, yeah, it helps you more in some situations at least.